Welcome to the first lecture in the Henry VIII series. Today, we will be focusing on the role of Henry's chief minister Thomas Wolsey by examining the question of, to what extent was Thomas Wolsey in charge of domestic policies from 1515 to 1527? This lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first section will examine Wolsey's rise to power to understand how he gained the role of Lord Chancellor in 1515. The second section will examine the different ways in which Wolsey sought to achieve domestic reforms in the areas of justice, finance, court expenditure, and the socio-economic problem of enclosure. We will then examine the amicable grant of 1525 in detail to understand why this domestic policy failed. Finally, we will examine both sides of the ongoing argument about whether or not Wolsey was an alter rex. Thomas Wolsey came from humble beginnings. His father is rumoured to have been a butcher but was likely to have been a cattle farmer. Despite his humble background, Wolsey received a good education. He attended Ipswich School and later went on to Magdalen College, Oxford, where he studied theology, the study of religion. He was a child prodigy. He earned a Bachelor of Arts aged 15 and a Master of Arts aged 18. His education played a crucial role in shaping his future career and success. Wolsey entered the church and embarked on a career that would see him rise rapidly through its ranks. His early career involved positions within the church, including becoming the Dean of Divinity for Magdalen College. In addition to his career in the church, Wolsey also had an interest in law. He pursued legal studies and eventually became proficient in matters of law, which became an asset in his administrative and political career. Despite his modest beginnings, Wolsey's intelligence, ambition, and talents propelled him into positions of prominence within both the church and the state. His rise to power and influence within the royal court and the church marked him as one of the most significant and influential figures of his time. By his early 30s, he had joined Henry VII's royal court and rose to become the royal almoner. In other words, he was in charge of giving out charitable donations for the poor on behalf of the crown. This placed him in an optimal position when Henry VIII succeeded the throne. Wolsey became a key member of the royal council shortly after Henry VIII ascended to the throne in 1509. His sharp intellect and administrative skills were quickly recognized, earning him a place among the king's advisors. The other members were part of Henry VII's Old Guard. They were conservative in nature, and the main thing they advised against was war with France. In contrast, Wolsey promised to make a campaign in northern France possible. In many ways, Wolsey acted as a father figure to the young Henry VIII. He acted as both a mentor and a role model, since he knew how to find solutions to difficult problems. After Wolsey managed the administration of Henry's first 2 military campaigns in France, Henry rewarded him as Lord Chancellor in 1515. Essentially, this made him the chief minister. This is a position he would keep for nearly 15 years, and during that time he took control of the day-to-day running of the country. In the same year, he was rewarded the position of cardinal by the Pope, to go alongside his position as Archbishop of York. He never became Archbishop of Canterbury, as it is a position awarded for life, and Archbishop Warham outlived Wolsey. Let's now examine Wolsey's domestic reforms. When I refer to domestic reforms, I mean the improvements that Wolsey tried to make to different aspects of England's government, including justice and finance. Henry did not take a strong interest in domestic policy. He was far more concerned with foreign policy and his ambitions in France, so he gave Wolsey a free rein when it came to domestic reforms. Thomas Wolsey resurrected the Star Chamber during his tenure as Lord Chancellor of England. The Star Chamber was created by Henry VII following the Battle of Stoke in 1487. It was designed to deal with cases of corruption, perjury, and acts of powerful individuals that often eluded traditional courts. However, by the time Wolsey came to power, the court had lost some of its influence. Wolsey sought to restore the authority of the Star Chamber. He utilized its powers to address cases of corruption and maintain law and order, especially when dealing with cases involving the nobility or influential figures. Under Wolsey's guidance, the Star Chamber underwent reforms aimed at enhancing its efficiency. He instituted changes to expedite the legal process, ensuring that cases were heard fairly and promptly. This approach earned him a reputation for fairness and impartiality. Wolsey also expanded the jurisdiction of the Star Chamber to include a broader range of cases, allowing it to deal with various offences, including perjury, fraud, and other crimes committed by the nobility or those in positions of power. As Lord Chancellor, Wolsey took a personal interest in the proceedings of the Star Chamber. His involvement ensured that the court operated efficiently and maintained its reputation for impartiality. Some historians believe that Wolsey's personal interest in the Star Chamber was due to his humble origins and his care for the poor. Others believe it was a way for Wolsey to stamp his authority over the traditional nobility. Enclosure, the practice of enclosing or fencing off common lands, became a more common practice in Henry VIII's reign. Wolsey was the first minister to conduct a government inquiry into enclosure. The inquiry was designed to investigate the effects of enclosure on society and was tasked with examining the consequences of enclosing common lands, such as its impact on the rural poor, agricultural practices, and the overall economy. The commission gathered testimonies from various individuals, including landowners, tenants, and those affected by enclosure. These testimonies helped in understanding the different perspectives and the extent of the problem. Based on the findings of the inquiry, Wolsey aimed to implement legal reforms to regulate the practice of enclosure. He sought to strike a balance between the rights of landowners to enclose their lands for agricultural innovation and the need to protect the interests of the rural population, especially those who relied on common lands for their livelihoods. However, the investigation had no serious long-term impact. Many landlords ignored the conclusions and enclosure continued to take place across the country. It would become a far more serious problem under Edward VI. Wolsey also reformed the tax system of 15ths and 10ths. This was the system whereby tax was collected as part of a parliamentary subsidy. A 15th was a tax that amounted to 1/15, or 6.67%, of the assessed value of goods and income. This was the tax of rural areas. Similarly, tenths was a tax of 10% of goods and income for those living in towns. Since Henry VII did not raise tax subsidies in the second half of his reign, each community in England was seriously undervalued. Wolsey conducted an investigation and used this to ensure every community was paying the correct amount based upon their present worth. Let's now examine the two ways in which Wolsey tried to reform the royal court. Firstly, Wolsey was successful in 1519 with an event that has been dubbed expulsion of the minions. The term minions does not refer to small yellow creatures in dungarees, it refers to Henry's favourites of the court. Wolsey wished to reduce the amount of waste in expenditure at the royal court. This meant reducing the size of the king's household, especially the men who joined Henry for pastimes in the Privy Chamber. In 1519, when Wolsey was at the height of his power, he succeeded in achieving this feat. Some historians believe he did it for the right reasons, in order to reduce expenditure and save the crown money. But far more historians believe Wolsey had selfish motivations, as he did not want these minions to gain too much power and influence within the Privy Chamber. In 1526, Wolsey decided to reform the court again. The Eltham Ordinances, named after Eltham Palace, were a set of reforms aimed to improve the efficiency of Henry VIII's court and reduce extravagant spending. However, this time Wolsey failed to achieve his goals. The ordinances aimed to curb the power and influence of the nobility within the court, particularly by regulating their presence and influence around the king. However, the nobility resisted these attempts to limit their access and influence over the king. Henry VIII's closest friends were opposed to Wolsey's reforms. They worked against the ordinances, undermining their effectiveness and persuading the king to disregard or modify the regulations to suit their interests. As Wolsey's power and influence grew, it sparked jealousy and resentment among others in Henry's court. This meant that Wolsey now had adversaries in court that were actively working against him. Let's now examine the most serious measure Wolsey tried to introduce, called the amicable grant. Amicable grant literally translates as a generous gift, when in actual fact it was a forced loan. It was introduced to raise funds for Henry's military campaigns, particularly the war against France. By 1525, Henry had already been on 3 campaigns to France and had exhausted the royal treasury. Parliament had granted the king a subsidy in 1523, and this had already been spent on a 3rd campaign that had been utterly futile. This meant that Wolsey could not go back to Parliament and ask for more money. In 1525 there was an epic battle between Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire and Francis I of France. It was the first time that muskets and gunpowder were used strategically in a battle. It resulted in a victory for Charles V and the capture of Francis I by the imperial army. This was a perfect opportunity for Henry, who had an alliance with Charles. If he could invade northern France while the French king was in captivity, then he could make substantial territorial gains. But of course, to achieve this, he needed sufficient funds to muster his troops and launch his invasion. Henry therefore turned to Wolsey and demanded that he found a way to raise the funds for another French campaign. Both knew this was the best opportunity they would ever have to capture lands in France. Wolsey arrived at the amicable grant as a solution, but he overestimated how well it would be received by the common people. The amicable grant triggered a rebellion in Lavenham in Suffolk. The tax was viewed as excessive and unjust by the local population, especially those working in the cloth industry and the rural labourers associated with the cloth industry. In response to the tax, protests erupted in Suffolk, with the cloth workers of Lavenham leading the rebellion. The protesters demanded the abolition of the illegal tax and voiced their discontent against the perceived injustices and economic hardships imposed upon them. At its peak, the Lavenham rebellion had 10,000 rebels, making it a serious popular rebellion. Henry VIII was brutal when crushing the rebellion. Several rebels were arrested, and some were executed as a deterrent to further unrest. However, the suppression of the rebellion was led by one of Wolsey's greatest rivals, leading magnate, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. In the coming years, Norfolk would become the patriarch of the Boleyn faction that plays a fundamental part to Wolsey's fall from power. Even though the Lavenham rebellion was easily quashed, the amicable grant had to be abandoned, so Henry did not have the funds for his military campaign in France. This was the first point when Wolsey had failed to meet Henry's expectations. He had to take the rap for the failed policy, and it resulted in him becoming even more unpopular with the nobility. Therefore it proved a key turning point in Wolsey's career, who was more aware than ever that his lofty position was based entirely upon giving the king what he most wanted. Let's now examine the debate about whether or not Wolsey was an alter rex. The term alter rex translates to mean other king. Both Wolsey's contemporaries and historians believe that Wolsey amassed so much power and influence that he was essentially ruling as a second monarch. Wolsey certainly acted like a king. He would wear his red cardinal robes for most public occasions, even though it was not customary for cardinals to always wear ceremonial dress. He once rode through London on a white mule, emulating Jesus' arrival into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, which was an ironic show of humility and piety. He was certainly a flamboyant personality who flaunted his wealth, and it was an open secret that he had a long-term mistress, even though as a cardinal he was supposed to be celebrate. The most obvious example of Wolsey acting as an alter rex was his two majestic palaces, York Place in the centre of London and his summer palace of Hampton Court, 20 miles south of London. Both palaces became so grand that they were the subject of mockery by Wolsey's contemporaries. Court poet John Skelton wrote, "Why come ye not to court? To which court? To the King's Court, or Hampton Court? For Hampton Court is the finer." Wolsey also had a lot of power since he was appointed as Lord Privy Seal in 1515. The Lord Privy Seal was a significant position in the royal household, responsible for the royal seal and overseeing documents that required the king's authorization. It essentially meant that Wolsey could use a stamp to give royal approval to laws and documents without the king's consent. It is believed that Wolsey did this on numerous occasions, since Henry did not pay much attention to domestic policies. However, there is a strong counter-argument that Wolsey was always the servant to Henry VIII. His job was to please Henry and to carry out his demands. The amicable grant is the perfect example of this, since Wolsey created this forced loan because Henry wanted funds to go to war in France, and when it backfired, Wolsey had to take responsibility for its failure. This would become even more evident when Wolsey fails to secure the annulment in his role as cardinal and papal legate. The Eltham Ordinances of 1526 is another key piece of evidence that Wolsey was only ever a servant to Henry VIII. In this instance, Wolsey was looking to reform the royal court in order to reduce waste, but also to curb the influence of royal courtiers. This is especially important since Wolsey had a different relationship with Henry as a father figure, and so did not spend evenings in the Privy Chamber entertaining the king. However, Henry did not appreciate this infringement into his personal space, and as a result the Eltham Ordinances failed. Let's now return to the overarching question of, to what extent was Thomas Wolsey in charge of domestic policies between 1515 and 1527? Firstly, it is worth noting that Henry started his reign using a conciliar system of government like his father, but Wolsey rose ahead of his fellow councillors by promising to give Henry exactly what he wanted. In the first years of Henry's reign, this was war with France. In 1515, Wolsey was appointed as Lord Chancellor. This resulted in a shift away from a conciliar system of government to a ministerial system of government. For the next 12 years, Wolsey took control of all domestic policy, including reforms to justice, finance, and an investigation into enclosure. He also tried to reform court expenditure, but this had limited success. Wolsey's biggest failing in domestic policy was the Amicable Grant of 1525, which was an illegal tax levied without the consent of Parliament in order to fund a war campaign in France. It caused a rebellion and Wolsey had to admit defeat. This was the first time that he had let Henry down on something that truly mattered to him. Historians have fiercely debated whether or not Wolsey was an alter rex or second king. There is evidence to suggest that Wolsey was able to wield significant influence and power during his time as chief minister. However, his status was entirely dependent on pleasing the king, and this would become even more evident in the late 1520s when Wolsey fails to secure the Pope's permission for Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon. Thank you for watching. Tune into my next lecture to examine the ways in which both Henry and Wolsey played a part in fashioning foreign policy in the first half of Henry VIII's reign.